everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast based on writers sitting around drinking coffee and talking about writing, publishing, and the whole creative process. We do not censor ourselves, so consider us PG-13. Your hosts today are John Schmidt and me, Jeannie Warner. This is episode 105, True Crime with Monique Patterson. Welcome, Monique.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Well, it's morning in Australia where I am.
It's morning in Australia. It's morning when people will hear this. We're very excited. Welcome to Tuesday.
Thank you so much.
So you have published 3 true crime novels, and I read on your background that you are a journalist. Tell us a little bit of how you made a leap from reporting and journalism to actually wanting to write a full-fledged novel on topics.
Absolutely. Well, as long as I can remember when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a writer. I always was very curious about things that were going on around me. I was in an article in our local newspaper when I was about 11 or 12 for playing table tennis, and they asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I said I wanted to be a journalist. And I started out at the local newspaper in the town that I grew up in, which is Warrnambool in southwest Victoria. And I moved around a fair bit, and I found myself, I was the editor of 3 newspapers in New South Wales, which is a state of Australia. And while I was the editor of the newspaper in Leeton in New South Wales, there was a tragic murder of a high school teacher, Stephanie Scott. She was about to get married to her high school sweetheart in a week's time. And at first, when we reported on it, she was being treated as a missing person. People thought that she may have been in a car accident and she might have ended up in one of the irrigation channels that were in the area. So there were searches going on for her for days and days. But tragically, it turned out that she had been murdered by a cleaner, which I think in the US you call them a janitor, at the high school where she worked. She'd gone in on a Sunday to do some final lesson plans because there was going to be a substitute teacher while she went on her honeymoon. And this janitor, cleaner, Vincent Stanford, he murdered and raped her, and he later said that he just had an urge to kill. And basically, so I covered that case from start to finish, and it was something that I couldn't get out of my mind. Stephanie Scott really was one of those people that touched the lives of everyone who ever met her. And I just felt compelled to write a book about her and the impact that she left on the world, and also the impact that her murder had on the small town of Leeton. It's only a town of about 10,000 people, so it had a real impact on a small town that had very little crime. And that's how I come to write my first book, United in Grief.
I was looking at all the details of that and reading some of the liner notes, and I haven't finished it. I've only finished the first chapter, but it compared favorably, I thought, with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which was 1959. It was the first American true crime novel. And there were a lot of similarities, small town, it could never happen to here. How can anybody be like that when, we're just a small town full of everyday folks? Did you find writing this as an opportunity to say, just because it's a small town, there can be mental problems everywhere. There can be deep, dark things in the heart of anyone. What were the themes and conclusions that you got out of writing this?
Absolutely. I think that is extremely true. And that's why I think that this murder was such a shock to Leeton, a small town where usually the only crimes they have is perhaps someone has had a few too many beers to drink outside one of the 2 pubs on a Saturday night and might get into a bit of trouble. I know that a lot of people before this happened didn't lock their doors. So yes, I think it was a stark reminder that evil can strike anywhere. It doesn't matter if you live in a city of 1 million people or a small town of 10,000 people. Things like this can happen anywhere and to anyone, sadly.
It really can. And it is, I enjoy the true crime novels, and I'm enjoying seeing it a little bit more on TV, is it helps shake people out of a certainty that, oh, everything is fine if we just pretend everything is fine. So I liked your theme that question, I'm not saying that you need to suddenly lock your doors. I mean, I lived in Sydney and never locked my door. I've lived here in America, and I lock doors are the enemy. But it can happen, and to pretend that it doesn't, to pretend that that kind of violence isn't possible, is unreasonable, and it keeps you from actually dealing with or addressing the problem in any way.
Absolutely true. And look, I think that the residents of Leeton, they experienced like a raft of emotions after the murder. Number one, how could this happen in Leeton? Number two, how lucky are we that we weren't the one who was murdered in this senseless crime? But then number three, thinking, well, that's not very nice to think that lucky it wasn't me. It was a roller coaster of emotions for the people who before, as you said, had never really contemplated the fact that something like this might happen in the town that they live in, a town that they considered safe.
Right. Tell us a little bit about researching it. What did you feel your responsibility was as an author of a book as opposed to just a journalist and reporter?
Well, I think that number one, when I wrote United in Grief, and I also focused on this in my second and third true crime book, I want to give the victim, or in the third book, the survivor, a voice. I want to focus on them as much as I possibly can rather than the offender. And that's what I tried to do as an author. It's also it's very different being a journalist than becoming an author. As a journalist, you have to absolutely take yourself out of the equation. But I think as an author, you have a little bit of leeway to be able to put yourself into the book a little bit. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because it also had an impact on me, the murder, as a journalist. And I too felt mixed emotions about it having an impact on me. I felt like, how dare I be impacted in an emotional way by the death of this woman who I'd never met? But it really did. And I think that as an author, I was able to, touch on the fact that these tragedies and these senseless crimes really can affect so many people, not just people that knew the victim and not just people that lived in the town where she did. It can really have an impact on so many people. And I think that that's why that there is an interest in true crime. I think that, as you mentioned before, it does remind people that senseless tragedies can happen everywhere. And another reason that I think that true crime is growing in popularity is because the truth is stranger than fiction. And I often think that if I read about some of the things that happen in true crime books in a crime fiction book, I would find it unbelievable.
Did you find anything in your investigation of this when you were writing about it that flew in the face of, I'm going to say, common TV cop procedure dramas are everywhere? You guys have The Thin Blue Line and some other very famous police dramas too. And certainly you've got a flood of them from America. Did you find that there was anything that wasn't perfectly according to, oh, this is exactly by the book? And was it hard to make it believable, or did it surprise you when you discovered it?
Look, I think that the police actually did a really good job in finding Vincent Stanford and connecting the dots and interviewing him. I think they did a really good job. But look, there were a lot of things about Vincent Stanford that really shocked me in doing the research. He was so cold when he recalled the details of how he hit Stephanie over the head. He punched her a number of times, dragged her into a storage room, raped her, and then murdered her. And then he left her, went home and had a sandwich for lunch, and then came back later and cleaned up the scene. And look, I think that one of the things that I found out is that the police did a really good job because their local knowledge was one thing that was like an aha moment for a sergeant at Leeton. What happened was, in the first interview that they had with Vincent, they asked him where he'd been on Easter Sunday, which is when Stephanie went missing. And one of the things he said was that he went to the Golden Apple supermarket. He told this to a constable who went back to the police station and handed the statement to the sergeant, who then said, but wait a minute, that's a lie. That supermarket wasn't open on Easter Sunday. So that prompted the sergeant to go back and have a further conversation with Vincent, and he was able to get him to confess to the murder.
And for anybody that is not aware across Australia, there is nothing open on holidays. So if you're trying to commit a major crime, don't do it on a major holiday. I'm just saying.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, look, I lived in a small town now named Mount Isa in North Queensland, and that was very much the fact. If you didn't get a carton of milk on a Sunday, you weren't drinking milk.
Did you use any points of view in the story, or was it all kind of a narrative? What devices did you use in terms of voice for it?
Yeah, look, I spoke to as many people I could who knew Stephanie, whether it was students or colleagues. I also spoke to Stephanie's sister, Kim Scott. So Stephanie's sister said that she knew that something was wrong because Stephanie was a really thoughtful sister and friend. And whenever it was someone's birthday, she would wait up till midnight so that when the clock hit 12:01, she could be the first person that would send a text message to the person whose birthday it was. And when Kim Scott, Stephanie's sister, didn't receive a text message on her birthday, she knew something was wrong. So basically, I tried to use the point of view from people who had met Stephanie, had loved her, and she'd had a lasting impact on her. There were also a number of community and sporting groups who decided to wear Stephanie's favourite colour, which was yellow, in their sporting matches after her murder. So as I mentioned earlier, I just really wanted to give the victim a voice and not focus on the person who killed her in cold blood.
I think that's neat. It's one of those things we've talked about before in terms of themes for a book and messages. And I applaud the idea of personalizing a victim rather than, I know this is just going on. I mean, I'm very frustrated with all of these. Let's have a movie about the latest bad guy. Like, I don't think that helps.
I agree.
So what do you want a reader, when you have a reader who reads your books, what do you want of them in terms of, do you want them to feel as if, more safe, less safe, just awareness? What are you looking for?
Well, first and foremost, I want them to know about the victim. So in my first two books, there was a victim. My second book is about a young man who died as a result of a hit-and-run accident. So first and foremost, I want them to be remembered. I want the books to be a tribute to them. But also in my second two books, I touch on how the justice system often fails victims and survivors of crime. And that's another theme that I try and touch on, and in the hope that it may lead to other people becoming aware of failures within the Australian justice system, and hopefully in the future for there to be some changes. Often there are issues with the wheels of justice turning way too slowly for victims. Other issues can be that if victims or survivors don't have a lot of money, then they can't access proper legal assistance. And in the case of my third book, which is about a survivor of clergy sexual abuse, the Catholic Church has deep pockets, and often that makes it very difficult for survivors of clergy abuse to receive any form of justice. So they're probably the two themes, a tribute to the victim or the survivor, giving them a voice, allowing their story to be told, and also highlighting some of the, deficiencies in the Australian justice system.
I just realized that you as a human being could be a perfect character in one of my books, because I've started writing and I have a couple novels out that I'm searching for publishing on, of a person that worked in police work but discovered that investigating these things is often driven by popularity and by money and by budget. Because this was all based in years real life experience, I've discovered that when you have somebody who's killing homeless people, or prostitutes or other unwanted or undesirables, nobody really investigates.
It's very true. And I even know working in the media that often these people, aren't getting the type of media coverage that someone like Stephanie Scott did. She was a beautiful young teacher about to get married in a week. She was in national news for a very long time, but perhaps if someone who is a vulnerable member of society, like you mentioned, someone is homeless or a prostitute, then often their cases aren't told in the media, which I think is a travesty.
It's absolutely true. All right. What advice, if somebody out there said they wanted to be a writer and they were fascinated by the same general area as you, where would somebody go to start investigating true crime stories if that's what they wanted to tell?
Well, we're just so lucky these days with the internet. There's so much information out there. But what I would also recommend is that Facebook is another really important tool for a journalist and an author. Often you will find that if you reach out to family members of people that have been a victim of crime, that they may want to tell their story. They may want to talk to you about the impact it's had on them, or like I mentioned before, they might just want to bring awareness to a failure in the justice system, or allow their loved one to ensure that they have some kind of part in Australian or another country's history. I think that it's really important that you have a real interest in the case and can make sure that you are able to deal with some of the issues that might come up for you personally. It can be very draining emotionally, but I think that if you do try and focus on the victim or the survivor, it can also be a very rewarding experience. Well, that's my experience anyway.
I can see that entirely. We have talked before about writing about what you're passionate about or what you feel or what write what you know, which means you have to go out and learn things. So it sounds like some of the things that you learned about here did not make you happy to know, but are still useful and important.
The advice that I'd give is to also, you mentioned before, write what you know. So if there has been a case that's occurred in a place near you where you have intimate details of that place that can really add weight to a book and put a reader right into the scene, or if you have some connection to someone that has been impacted by a crime, I think that can really help transport the reader back to the place where it happened.
That makes perfect sense. All right, let me throw the dial in a completely more cheerful direction. You've also written a children's picture book.
I have.
How do you go from true crime and death and murder into adorable picture books? I love the variety.
Well, I think that that's the reason that I did it. I have always had a real interest in true crime, as I mentioned, and I'm fascinated that the truth is stranger than fiction. But I'm also mum to two boys. My oldest son, Cale, is 11. My youngest, Jackson, is nearly 3. And sometimes I need a break from true crime. As I mentioned, it's emotionally draining reading about the evil that lives in parts of our society. So I wanted to do something fun, and I wanted to do something that my boys might be proud of and enjoy reading and telling their friends that their mum has a picture book. And my first children's book is called How Much Can a Koala Bear? Now, I grew up in
that could go deep really quickly, because I think a koala could bear a great deal.
Just the engineering complications, really horrible. And then thinking of it in a true crime sense, how much could the koala bear? But it's an adorable picture book, and you were saying?
Yeah, well, it's basically, it's about a misunderstood koala, and obviously a lot of people think, call them a koala bear, which they're not, but it's just about a misunderstood koala, and koalas love to sleep. They would sleep all day if we let them. And people think they're cute and cuddly, and they like to look at them and point at them and take photos of them. But it's just about a misunderstood koala who's actually pretty grumpy because all he wants to do is sleep. And it's also got some other native Australian animals in there. And it's kind of, I grew up near Tower Hill, which is a national park near Koroit. And, you know, we'd see koalas, emus, kangaroos, the occasional snake. And so it's just a bit of a fun book, but letting people know that if a koala doesn't seem that happy to see you, it's because he's just trying to sleep and you're annoying him.
Also, I love that they sound exactly like enormous pigs.
Yeah.
So you're saying, John?
Oh, no, I was just saying no wombats. But
there isn't a wombat that I've ever seen in Tower Hill. And no wombats in this book, but maybe in one to come.
I vote for wombats. They are, especially for someone not of Australia, a very surprising beast, because you think cute, and no, it is more like an actual bear, ripping the undersides out of Toyotas and etc. I think your true crime novel in the animal kingdom would be the narcotics case with the koala, all of that, eucalyptus, and of course the car dismantler of the wombat. But you're not going to do that, and I'm happy for that. So onward.
I don't know. I think we're taking her in a new direction. Monique, do you want to have the koala detective?
Very true. But do you know that I know that wombats can be grumpy, but on occasion they are kept as pets by people, and they actually can be quite cuddly, as opposed to the koala who, despite people thinking, oh, I want to cuddle a koala, they're not really into cuddles.
I could see that. And poetry. You've written poetry and published poetry.
You've published poetry.
I have, yeah. I published a poetry book. That was probably a couple of years ago. I just enjoy poetry because it allows you to, I guess, speak about how you see the world and how you see it differently on certain days, depending on your mood and what's going on in your life.
Okay, got to ask the evil question. Are you in any way related to the famous Australian poet Banjo Patterson?
I wish I could say yes, but not to my knowledge.
I decided
that would be a good selling point.
As a writer and a poet in her own right, we're just going to call you Mandolin.
No, it would be good to be able to put on the cover of my books, you know, distant relative of the great Banjo Patterson, but I think that would be a stretch.
Or it could be hilarious if you put it in parentheses, no relation, because then it makes people automatically think by stating a denial, it still makes an association.
Very true. Good idea.
You are a known true crime author, and true crime has a lot of denials in it. So, yeah.
So what do you use for tools and methods? Are you a Scrivener girl? Are you just any word processing program? Do you have a notebook? What are your tools and methods?
Well, before I start writing a book, I'm really just trying to shape the book together in my mind. And I find that I usually do that for a couple of weeks. I do sometimes write notes on my iPhone, just like a word to try and remind me of something that I want to include there. I do sometimes write basic notes. I don't do a full plan of a book. I'd prefer to just kind of write notes that remind me of a certain thing in my mind. It might be a word or a sentence. And after I've done that for a couple of weeks, that's when I usually get started on the book. And I find that as a journalist over the years, the only thing that really motivates me to write are deadlines. So I have to be pretty strict with myself and set myself deadlines. So
do you do it in terms of word count or just achievable dates?
Well, when it comes to the start, it's usually just the research. So in the first week or so, I would set a time frame for myself where I'm doing research. I work best in the mornings after my first coffee. So usually when I'm writing a book, I would take annual leave from my full-time job as a journalist because I need to be able to focus totally on the book. So I guess for the first week, if that's how long it might take to get some of the research done, I would set myself a goal to perhaps do 4 hours straight on research each day. And then when I get to the part where I'm writing, I do try and set myself a word count of probably, 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. But I do find myself sometimes being very distracted by other things and listening to true crime podcasts or finding another interesting true crime story that I've found on the internet. So it can be hit and miss.
You have me standing by waiting for the whole Rowan and Hannah Baxter story coming up next, because that was shocking. And I thought there was a great story to be told on how some of the reporters wrote about it, because here's a guy who stalks his ex, murders her, sets the car on fire, and all the reporters seem to want to write about, well, he was an ex-rugby player and we care, rather than saying, holy crap, domestic violence, what the hell? And I think it changed the nation for good ways by opening conversations. So
absolutely. Across the world, I mean, we have this fascination with celebrities or, sports stars. And you're right. In that case, it was disgusting the way that some of it was reported. And look, I am a journalist, but sometimes I'm horrified by the way that other journalists write about cases. Even in the murder of Stephanie Scott, who was my first book about, there were some journalists who went with the angle that she was a runaway bride.
Oh, dear.
Yes, yeah. Which was horrific. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's really sad when someone is a celebrity, so we focus on that rather than the crime that they have committed. And that's why I always try and focus on the victim.
I think it's important to do, and I love that you're doing it. Do you have anything coming up? What are you writing on currently?
I'm actually writing a book about a woman from Perth in Western Australia. She found out when she was 27 that when she was a 2-year-old, she had been a victim of a terrible, terrible bashing. She had been beaten to within an inch of her life. Doctors said that she was lucky to survive. And she found out that this was a secret that her family had hidden from her all her life. And she found out by accessing Freedom of Information documents that the person who most likely almost killed her was her stepfather at the time. And he was never prosecuted for what he did. And she has never forgiven her mother because she got taken out of her mother's care and he continued a relationship with this man, all the while knowing that he probably nearly killed her daughter.
That's a heavy story. Sounds like it's worth telling.
Yeah, it's a really sad story, and it's just about her journey, about finding this out, accessing the information about what happened to her, trying to find the man who most likely nearly killed her, and I guess the impact that it's had on her already rocky relationship with her mother.
Yeah. No, these are fascinating things to delve into. And I think these are topics that have never really been talked about very much. So good on you for doing it.
Not so much in true crime. That's the beauty of your writing. And I'm sorry, I am to use an old phrase, weak-livered to do what you do. But you're opening up horrors that some would not want to see to show compassion. And when I looked at your books, I didn't read any of your poetry. I saw a lot of compassion, because how much can the koala bear? Well, if you'd stop hugging him, he could get a nap. Well, that's compassion.
Yeah, that's so true.
And we will put links to Monique's stories and the other interesting things we mention on our website, which is www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. You can also find us on Facebook or Twitter. We answer email. Monique, if somebody has a question, can they just write to you on it?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, people can just easily find me on Facebook. I'm Monique Patterson, author on Facebook. I'm always happy to respond to questions or just have a chat to someone if they're interested in the writing process. More than happy to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web support magic is brought to you by Deirdre McGaffey, and our sound engineer and backup web spider is David Welsh. Our intro music is Pretty Maid Milking a Cow, and our exit music is Breakfast with the Morning Person, both by Michael Engberg. You can hear more from Michael Engberg at manyhatsmusic.com. Our podcast sponsor is Jackal Designs down in Sydney, enabling you all to buy cool WDC swag, like our new 100-episode celebration shirt. Thanks for visiting with us today, Monique.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
And you out there, thanks for listening.